now. We've got Tim Kanagaita and Jeff Sizer from Genesis Design, who are going to kick us off, and we're doing a MedTech hypothetical that's really not that hypothetical at all, because it is around designing in very rapid stage process ventilators in a kind of MedTech innovation context, working in a collaborative sense. That what can we leverage in our community to actually accelerate the development? And this is an example that's obviously very current and relevant, and it is, I mean, it is hypothetical, but we're also obviously doing it in the context of you know, what's going on at the moment. So I'm going to hand over to Tim, or is it Tim first, and then we also have a panel coming up, which is going to discuss through these areas where we've got different expertise across this design the spectrum, from product development, and Gary Jones from Fledge. We've got Serena Ross from CircuitWise. We've got Callum Beer from AI Australia and Strategic on Health. We've also got Liz Boyce, for IP specialist from Dentons, and then we've also got electronics from Ingenuity, Jean-Paul McKeon. So I'll hand it over to yourself first, Tim, and Jeff as well, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion.
Look, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, and a reminder that this is an event of the New South Wales Active MedTech Community, which was launched last December, and we started running webinars this year. We are meant to, once a quarter, have a face-to-face meeting hosted by Venture Cafe in Macquarie Park, but unfortunately that's all gone out the window. At the moment, we're now doing this, this live Zoom session. The idea of these is to do what we call a MedTech hypothetical, where we take a potential product that's just an idea in somebody's head and talk about what it would take to make it into a real product. In this case, we've decided to focus on the rapid development of an automatic ventilator, because that's very topical at the moment. So what I thought we'd do is I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what's been happening, and a very light overview, because I think just about everyone in this audience will probably be quite familiar with what's going on around the ventilator space. Then I'm going to hand over to Jeff Sizer to present a concept for a ventilator that is hypothetical, but could potentially be turned into one. So it's a real kind of design. And then we're going to ask some panelists, some expert people to speak to that topic, and then we're going to go to the audience to take some questions. And I've noticed a people there. I noticed Grant Bennett coming online from Brandwood CKC. So I'll definitely get Grant to be speaking, and Nathan will pick out some other people as well. So just to recap, you know, the challenge, you'd have to be hiding under a rock to not to know this really, but the real issue with COVID-19 is that at the peak of the crisis, we are going to need ventilators, and the reason is that the virus attacks the lungs, resulting in what they call acute respiratory distress syndrome. And there, obviously, as everyone knows, varying degrees of it, but at the peak of it, they need a full anesthetized ventilator. That and the key issue here is that they need to be, these patients need to be on these ventilators for up to 21 days until their lungs repair. If they just needed to be on them for a day or two, we might not have such a big problem. But basically, as soon as a ventilator is occupied, it's out for the count almost throughout the entire peak, and that's the key issue there. So so obviously we're going to run out. There have been lots and lots of responses globally. You've probably seen the conversion of the scuba masks, into ventilators. And, at the bottom there, that's actually a racing car company, I think, did that one. But Dyson, the vacuum cleaner people, have done one. There's open source projects in Ireland, the US, all over the place, people doing lots of things. But generally what's happening is that governments have been trying to find somebody who does something in their country that's already a ventilator and really supporting those people to ramp up. The issue is that those countries, you might have heard that Gladys Berejiklian ordered a large number of ventilators from the US. The company agreed to ship them, but then the US government refused to allow them to leave the country. So that's the issue. Australia doesn't have a domestic manufacturer of a sort of intensive care grade ventilators. We'll talk about ResMed in a moment, but by and large, the government has been exploring all of the possible options and basically pursuing multiple streams. So some of those options, they fall into 4 categories: repurposing, things like getting veterinary machines that you know, can repurpose for human use, trying to convert sleep apnea machines and so forth, and recommission retired ones. There's one we'll talk about a little bit later on, or try and rapidly develop new ones. And we're going to hypothetically talk about that today. At the moment, my understanding is that ResMed's Astral 150, which is actually a life support ventilator, but I believe it runs on batteries. So it's not quite exactly what you want to keep somebody going for 21 days. So I don't know too much more about it than that, but and people in the audience might know more, but I believe that ResMed is rising to the occasion very admirably, but they still have challenges, so therefore other options may be required. What we've been doing, and when I say we, it's largely Genesis Electronics Design is one of the sponsors of this community, along with CircuitWise. We've been participating in working groups and interacting with the government, doctors, and so forth to explore the range of options that are available. In particular, there's been a group led by University of New South Wales and University of Sydney, and a range of physicians that have been supporting that. In particular, there's a gentleman called Dr. Duncan Campbell, who invented something called the Campbell Ventilator. You can see the picture there, way back in 1975. And Dr. Campbell is retired now, and is my guess, he's actually 93 years old, but very alert and very switched on. So we worked with him. It just so happened that Dr. Campbell was a client of Genesis. We did a cardiac output monitor product for him just only about 5 or 6 years ago. So he knew us and contacted us when people started contacting him. We've also been looking at the specifications. The New South Wales government did put out some specifications to people like us about what they required. The UK government put out a very, very detailed requirements that we went through and analysed and worked out basically what was needed. So what I'll do now is hand over to Jeff Sizer to explain the concept, and then we'll go to the panel.
Okay, thanks, Tim. How's my audio?
Perfect. Can hear you well.
Okay, good. I actually have Plan B set up in the background, so the internet's a little bit flaky here, but I've got 2 independent connections. So faced with this challenge, and with the major concern facing health authorities around the world, is what happens when they run out of ventilators. People suffering from the COVID-19 disease at the extreme completely lose their ability to breathe, and they need full ventilator support, as in you'd find in an intensive care unit. This is only a small percentage of patients, sort of under 4%, I believe. But if you look at the scenario in Italy, where people were effectively being chosen about who would be put on a ventilator and who would not, simply because of a shortage. And this is in a modern first world country with a first-class health system. So this is a major problems threatening virtually any country. And of course, Australia is equally exposed. You've probably heard a lot about flattening the curve and so forth and so forth. Well, if that happens, all well and good, but if it doesn't, there will be a major problem in the availability of ventilator machines. So faced with this challenge, I've turned my mind to how could Genesis, as an ISO 13485 certified designer of active medical devices, rise to the occasion to support activities around coming up with an emergency design and implementation of a ventilator that could be rapidly put into meaningful volume production. And by meaningful, we mean many thousands of units for Australia. And of course, you extrapolate that about what the world demand is going to be, the numbers are phenomenal. So what's presented on the slide before you is a very simple conceptual depiction of an idea presented by Dr. Duncan Campbell. It doesn't fully represent the design of the machine that we saw in the previous slide, but it is representative of what can be done to implement a simple, safe ventilator capable of supporting intubated patients, i.e. with the tube down their throat, or less severely affected individuals who need breathing support that could be provided by some form of face mask. So the concept's fairly simple. The device works by having an oxygen source, standard source available in hospitals or via oxygen bottles through a control valve that controls the pressure and flow of oxygen. So the oxygen is then introduced into the patient's circuit via a venturi, which entrains atmospheric air that mixes with the oxygen. There's provision for an additional oxygen feed if you want more oxygen than the pressure that's required to give the required patient airflow allows. The oxygen or enriched air, oxygen-enriched air then can flow through a black flow valve to prevent contamination of the circuit at the input side of the machine with a conventional mechanical pressure gauge, which we saw on the previous instrument. And this air is ultimately fed to the patient during the inhalation cycle. During the exhalation cycle, the valve on the bottom path opens and the valve on the feed path can close to save oxygen, so that as the patient breathes out, the air then flows out through the exhaust path and through a filter and ultimately, desirably, into a capture system, so that aerosols coming from the patient then don't risk infecting the staff that are serving that patient. So the concept is really very simple in terms of the airflow, but there are some additions. On the right-hand side, you'll see an addition of sensors. This is beyond what you would find in these 1980s technology type ventilators. So the sensors can be a differential pressure sensor across an orifice to measure flow, and a pressure sensor that measures pressure relative to atmospheric for the actual patient pressure. And we're talking about maximum pressures of the order of 30 centimeters of water is the sort of pressure we're talking about. So it's relatively low compared with 1 atmosphere is the breathing pressure support. So of course we have to then control this system. The basic electronic control for the core function is extremely simple. And Tim, incidentally, interrupt me if I'm starting to rabbit on at length about things. So we need to be able to turn the valves on and off for the breathing cycle and have that adjusted so we can have rates of between a few breaths every second up to a few breaths per minute, depending on the patient's support requirements. And the ratio of inhalation time to exhalation time also needs to be controlled. So thinking about how one would do this within constraints of very simple, readily available electronics that can be rapidly put into operation, a couple of potentiometers into analog to digital converters into a microcontroller can allow you to set the breathing rate and the ratio of inhalation to exhalation time very simply. And that is all you really need to basically control the unit, to switch the valves for the breathing cycle. The pressure and the feed to the patient is controlled manually by the operator by adjusting the oxygen flow for optimum patient functions. Okay, Tim's flipped to the next slide. This differs significantly from the modern day intensive care ventilators that have a lot of automated control features, to the extent that they will actually sense the patient's breathing and switch modes depending on whether the patient needs simple support to their breathing or whether they actually need breathing to be taken over from them. So looking at the core functions that we need to achieve beyond the simple on-off control of the ventilation cycle, monitoring of the adjustable parameters, in this instance the pressure and the flow rate and the settings for that, which we can determine by the feedback available to us by sensing those parameters. So desirably one would automate those settings, but to keep this device simple, the hypothetical design is based on those being set up manually by the operator, but then the feedback is used to control the parameters by feeding back that information to the operator. So measurement of the actual parameters and the instrumentation of a device by the addition of pressure and flow and display of those waveforms on a simple display would actually modernize the 1980s device quite dramatically and bring its core capabilities into a line with modern day ventilators. And incidentally, I did mention that the concept of using a tried and proven simple ventilator design is on the basis of being able to come up with a regulatory compliant, safe, fail-safe and effective design without starting from scratch and risking having a Heath Robinson machine held together with string and sealing wax that can potentially do more harm than good. So in terms of the basic functions we need to extend is to have alarms of the operation. In other words, is the device actually operating and cycling as it should? And also failure modes. Is the pressure and flow to the patient either excessive or inadequate and is not adequately supporting the patient's breathing? So in terms of some of the more detailed parameters, they're shown on the bottom right there. The peak pressure, called PEEP, is a very important parameter during the cycle to make sure that you're not injuring a patient who would typically have very impaired lungs that would be easily damaged. And the core functions, the respiratory rate, in other words, how fast the patient is breathing, the ratio of inspiration to expiration, the tidal volume, which is the amount of oxygen-enriched air into the patient, and then CO2 enriched air out of the patient that is occurring on each of the ventilation cycles. So those are basic parameters that we would wish to be able to monitor and display to the operators. One of the core constraints in this situation is you're dealing with operators who are not trained on intensive care ventilator use, and so they may not have used a ventilator. There are quite a large number of old technology ventilators that typically have been repurposed into the veterinary space that are extremely difficult to use, and there are no trained operators in the system. So that's a huge problem of how would you repurpose existing ventilators and make them safe to use. And that equally would apply to this rebirth of this this Campbell ventilator. So Tim?
Yep. And Jeff, just that last point there, the mandatory versus the sensor-driven. I wrote that, so I might explain it. The sensor-driven is where the ventilator can actually detect that the patient's trying to breathe and work with the patient, whereas mandatory is when they're essentially completely sedated and are driving the breathing for the patient. I'll just move on so we can get through the time with the session. Jeff?
Yeah, so there are many challenges facing this approach, and we'll talk about the electronics and mechanical design and regulatory challenges in due course. Of course, this type of ventilator is highly dependent on oxygen supply, and it's wasteful of oxygen compared with a modern design, which would actually have a turbine to generate pressurized air that then just needs oxygen enrichment. We're relying on the oxygen flow and oxygen pressure to actually provide the pressure feed to the patient of the oxygen enriched air. There is some good news in this front in that we're talking about using standard oxygen supplies that are available in hospitals, and BOC gases have been engaged. They have a number of oxygen generation plants around the country, and their single highest capacity plant could produce a week's worth of supply per day of oxygen. So producing enough medical grade oxygen is not a problem. Transportation is somewhat of a problem, certainly for bottled oxygen, because, oh, surprise, surprise, there's a concern that medical organisations are actually stockpiling and hoarding oxygen bottles. So there could be a need for the government to step in and make sure that oxygen can be got to where it needs to be got. But
I will get you to move on now, Jeff, because
I was saying beyond that, oxygen supply to support this initiative is not a concern.
That if someone, say Australian government, was to come to a group of experts like yourself, which included design experts, which included electronics experts, manufacturing, medical experts, IP, capital experts, what would it take for you to collectively come together and in a very rapid function be able to produce this, but also ensure that the quality is still there to be able to deliver that to market and to be able to effectively deliver for patient needs? So I think that's really the focus of this discussion. And I might hand it over to Tim to really lead that discussion. And I just first wanted to just get everyone who's going to be a part of that just to say a quick hi and where you're from. So I might start, I'll just go around. I'll start with just picking randomly. So Serena, would you like to just say a quick few words and introduce yourself, please?
My name's Serena. I'm the General Manager of CircleWise Electronics.
Perfect, thank you. And Callum? Oh, you're on mute, Callum, sorry.
Am I on mute now?
You're good.
Okay. Hi guys, I'm Callum Burr, lead our Australia and also Strategic on Health, which is a fund investing in health-specific assets.
Excellent, thank you. And Gary from Fledge, Gary Jones.
Yeah, got that. Hi, I'm Gary Jones. I'm the founder and CEO of Fledge Innovation Labs. So we're an incubator that specialises in supporting medtech startups.
Excellent. And Liz?
Hi everyone, I'm Liz Boyce. I'm a partner at Dentons Australia. I co-chair our life sciences group, so I do a lot of corporate legal advice with life sciences companies at all stages.
Excellent. And last but not least, Jean-Paul?
Hi there, I'm John Paul, Business Development Manager for Ingenuity Electronics Design Group. So yeah, we're a product development consultancy and we do a lot of medical devices.
Excellent, thank you. So Tim, did you kind of want to kick it off and based on where we've come to so far, pose to our group, really, what are some of those key considerations around from their different angles and areas of expertise?
Yeah, and look, thanks for that. And sorry, Gary, I wasn't quite sure whether you were going to turn up or not, so I didn't have you on the list of panelists there. But anyway, look, I've got the questions on the screen there. The only thing I wanted to say is that in this session, we're not trying to solve the whole problem of COVID-19. It's a hypothetical about if we were going to create a device from scratch, how would we go about it? So I think you all know what to do. We may as well just get started. Did we get David Jones from Designing Industry introduce himself? I didn't see him come up. But maybe we could get David Jones to start off and introduce himself and provide his comments on what Jeff Sizer put forward.
Hi everybody, I'm David Jones. I'm the head of Design and Industry. We're an industrial design consultancy, product development consultancy. We are certified to 13485 for developing medical devices. Thanks Tim for the introduction. To I guess address the questions at hand, I guess the biggest one is the lead time and what critical paths are going to be there for all those involved. It's not just one party developing that product. There'll be numerous stakeholders involved, and the lead time will come down to the resources and the components availability, getting the certifications. Design industry are very used to developing products under a high level of time pressure. And for us, we'd put a team on it that would take a look at the product from a usability side of things, but really just jump straight into the development so that it's set up for quick manufacture, design for manufacture.
Okay, John Paul from Ingenuity.
Hi there. Yes, well, we would be keen to contribute if a new design was really what was the key thing to do here. I suppose the question I have just to start off is, do we need to redesign it from scratch, or can we reuse a pre-existing approved design or even an open source design? It seems to me that the problem is more one of production rather than of design.
Can you explain the benefits of using a pre-existing design from the medical device development point of view?
From a development point of view, I mean, I'm just talking about speed here. If the issue is we've basically got a couple of weeks before the peak of the virus is going to hit. The lead time it takes to design something, we can compress it as much as we can with really focusing everybody's energies and collaborating. But if there's already a design that exists and it's not owned by a company in Australia, it seems to me if we're willing to put the economy on hold and spend billions doing that, then surely we could afford some license fees to buy in some designs or even just commandeer them.
Medtronic actually open sourced one of their ventilators last night. Has anybody looked at that yet?
Yeah, Jeff Sizer did have a quick look at it. Jeff, do you want to spend 30 seconds explaining your view of what they put out?
Yes, I've had a look at the design. They provided design data pack for the mechanical design, which I've not looked at, but I have looked at the electronics, and just overnight they've released the source code for the software, but no documentation. They provided the specifications and also the circuit schematics, but I've assessed the design. It dates back to 2006. It uses a microcontroller of that vintage, which looks ancient by today's standards, and I would be extremely doubtful if there are not a lot of obsoleted components in it. So replicating that design would be a challenge.
Serena, that might be a good segue into hearing from Serena Ross at CircuitWise, who lives and breathes sourcing components. Do you want to make your comments now, Serena?
Yeah, I had a look at it overnight as well, and I would say the same thing. In this circumstance, we need a design that's fresh and up to date so that we have extreme availability of parts. At the moment, we're having a lot of problems sourcing things from overseas, and if we're trying to work off a 2006 design, there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to get all those parts, especially at volume. And it only takes one component to fall over the whole process. So it was quite a complex mechanical build too, with a lot of custom parts. So all that sort of stuff takes a really long time to get in.
Okay, Liz Boyce from Denton's, do you want to make some comments now?
Sure. A project like this is obviously going to require a huge amount of collaboration because no one has the answer and we're time poor. And so as a lawyer, I would say that you need the rules of engagement for that collaboration. So I'm not talking about overly complicated agreements, but if you've got a group of people that's going to be working together on this project, you can't simply assume that everyone's working towards the same goal. So you actually want to create something very simple that says, this is what we're each doing, this is what each party is responsible for, what they can expect of the other. So you've got that clarity. And the second thing I would say is leadership. So to be able to tap into experienced leadership, people who've developed products like in the past, people who have perhaps done that in a third world environment where you've got to be very quick and nimble, you'd want to tap into those. So that's why a network like this is really important, because you can see all these faces around. There's a lot of expertise in this group.
Now, did we hear from Callum already? Sorry, you did speak earlier. I wasn't quite sure if we heard everything from you, Callum. Any advice?
Yeah, I think something like this, well, I think two parts. I think one is the challenge, and the second is the opportunity. From a challenge perspective, at the moment, a lot of our risk appetite has gone down quite considerably, right? So I'm just talking about private capital, not government money. So the risk appetite is so low at the moment. this may be the best technology and is so relevant and immediate. Two challenges. One is the risk appetite is so low right now for just about anything, including the existing LPs and people that have contributed towards putting the fund together. Everyone is hurting right now financially, and so there are some challenges in mobilizing capital in the most immediate moment. Not to say people aren't prepared to put cash and small bits of money, as discretionary funds as opposed to sort of the core fund. But in terms of that funding piece, that's unfortunately a bit limited right now. Second challenge I have from a capital point of view is, just getting all of our investment community together, investment committee together in order for us to reevaluate our mandate. And I speak to other funds that we partner with to see whether or not they're funding into Corona. And look, there is a mixed bag. There's a mixed bag of private capital out in the marketplace. On one hand, and we're kind of in that sense as well, where situations like Corona sounds like an opportunity in the short term, but that has never been our mandate, right? And so, and a lot of other companies, that has not been the mandate to sort of look at these reactory. It's perhaps the single most important problem right now. But what happens after Corona, and what happens after a year later? And so how do we deal with that? How do we make a one-off call to assess the sort of long-term opportunity vis-a-vis short-term opportunity? How do we break all the mandates we've got our investors signed up for? I'm not saying it's impossible. We've done deals like that in the past, but I think it represents a challenge organizationally for us to mobilize capital in the short term.
Thanks.
That's the challenge part, Tim.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take advantage. I saw Grant Bennett here from Brandwoods. Could I get Grant? Could I get you just to introduce yourself and talk about the regulatory challenges in this?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. Hopefully I'm coming through reasonable. Grant Bennett, I'm the CEO of Brandwood CKC. We're a regulatory and quality consultancy firm based in Sydney. Look, I mean, like most, there's loads of discussions around this, and obviously from a regulatory point, there's a huge amount of information flowing, both not just locally but also internationally. I guess from a regulatory sense, there's now been a call from a number of different governments around people that have not manufactured medical devices to come to a call of action and start to manufacture. And I think one of the key things they need to consider is they're still looking to manufacture medical devices, and they're still going to be regulated as such. There's a fantastic article just pushed out by the TGA actually around how they're going to be managing these sorts of products getting manufactured and what their expectations are. I think the key thing for anyone that's looking to do this, and we have heard a number of times the 13485 mentioned, there is an expectation that there's going to be quality controls around the activities. So it's important that you do recognise that before you start to head down that road. And the other part is, these things will get reviewed. The push by the government is still to have approved devices used. And with that, obviously, you need to take that into consideration as you move forward and make sure you can sort of get it to the point of approval. The TGA has implemented some expedited pathways for particular technologies, including ventilators. So, there is an opportunity there that, to basically support what's being called for, but just be mindful that there is a need to still have those quality controls and things in place.
Okay, thanks very much, Grant. We've got one more panelist, and we're going to throw it open to the audience, and I'm going to hand it back to Nathan to facilitate that. But I just encourage everyone to, if you've got any thoughts or any questions, can you please type them into the chat, and I'll ask panelists to have a look at the questions coming up in the chat, but we'll let Nathan drive that interaction and I guess nominate people from the audience address certain questions and to nominate if anybody from the audience wants to speak. I think you can put your hand up in this. I believe you can somewhere, but anyway, yeah, just Gary Jones. Gary spent many of his waking hours for the last 2 or 3 weeks thinking, living and breathing this entire challenge. So Gary, if you could just for a couple of minutes, give any final perspectives on this before we go to open discussion.
Well, I started off with a list of things that would be worth talking about. And most of them have been addressed already, like filtering the room air and filtering the expired air, which is extremely important to stop aerosols getting into the atmosphere, especially in intensive care units. The danger being that if aerosols get into the atmosphere, healthcare workers breathe them in, they become infected, then they become patients, and you get this runaway cycle in intensive care where carers turn into patients, and then, you know, it doesn't matter how much equipment you have. If you don't have enough healthcare workers to operate the equipment, you know, the healthcare system collapses, and you get to a point where fatalities go up instead of going down. We've talked about quality. We've talked about PEEP, which is really good. We've talked about lead times and supply chains and funding. I would have thought that a lot of people would be coming to the fore with funding for this, not looking for a return on investment, but as a social impact investment. The government's doing that, but I'm sure some of the funds are looking at doing that as well. Two things that I think would be worth talking about from a technical point of view is having, I just didn't see anything in the schematics there about humidification. It's very important that the air be humidified. I'm sure that's in the design somewhere. And how do you provide technical support for something that's relatively new? If you're making them by the tens of thousands and they're going all over the country, all over the world, how would you provide technical support for that?
Great questions. Okay, look, Nathan, I might hand it back to you now to facilitate the question time. And thanks all the panelists for taking the time to think about this and give those summaries.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to everyone. I think actually just leading on from what Gary said, I'd be keen to kind of go back to any of our panelists to comment on that, because it's raised quite a few considerations there around the development across the spectrum. So did anyone want to comment on some of those areas that Gary addressed? And we've got some questions coming through in our chat too, and we'll start going through them.
The case of who's going to speak first. Jeff, did you want to talk to that humidification topic?
Yeah, I can talk to it. And the conceptual design that I've sketched up was really hiding the devil of the detail. So the approach would be to take a tried and proven design and then a specification. So it's a very good question. Where do you find a specification? There are regulatory compliance documents that are hugely complicated and convoluted. But the specification that the UK has brought out is very clear-cut and easy to read and straightforward. So it's absolutely essential that we would start with a well-known, effectively a statement of the user needs in the normal way that one would for any medical device development, and satisfy those to the greatest practical extent. Now, I have looked through that UK document, and a simple design got into place quickly could not necessarily provide all of the capabilities asked for up front. But there's no point waiting till it's too late to have something that's perfect, that satisfies all the needs. If one can come up with something that meets the minimum requirements for safety of the patient and the staff and is effective, and get that into the production process, then think about maybe adding some enhancements by software upgrades down the track as time permits. So there will definitely be a fine balance to be met.
Thanks, Jeff. And we've had a few questions there from Mike Nichols. Mike, did you want to ask or comment on the discussion so far?
Yeah, I'm thinking practically. Right now, the Department of Industry is looking to local industry to try to build something. So this is actually a right now discussion versus a hypothetical for me. Where would we build this? Who would build it? What facilities do we have available? Clearly, we have to build mechanical, software, hardware, as in electronics. Where does that happen? Who can do that locally? I know about Flextronics out at Penrith, Padstow that could do the electronics. Where would we get mechanicals built? Where would that actually all come about? I'm thinking logistics. How would this happen?
We could have built both. So we're ISO 13485 accredited, and we build a lot of medical devices in our factory in Bella Vista. So we could do the end-to-end of the building of it there.
Okay.
We have approached the government about building the ventilators in our facility as well.
Which group were you with again, sorry?
Circuit-wise electronics.
Thanks.
One of the real questions, it's one thing to actually be able to manufacture it physically, but you also need to be certified. And I'd be interested to hear what Grant Bennett would say on that. Is Grant, if CircuitWise is certified to manufacture printed circuit board assemblies, and there has to be, for any given product, there has to be a product sponsor, you know, somebody who takes the liability of the device. So, you know, if we are going to manufacture tens of thousands of these things, who's liable for these things if they start, you know, killing patients because, you know, there was some flaw in the design? And if we're going to do that in a really rapid way, can you see any path forward, Grant?
The liability question I'm going to leave to Liz. With regards to the certification, I mean, the push is always going to be to have an ISO certified company doing the manufacturing for, you know, obviously involved. You know, looking at what the MHRA have pushed out with regards to their guidance, and I suspect that we'll probably head down a similar path here in Australia, will be that you don't need to be certified in this under these current circumstances. You will, you know, you still need to have those processes in place, and I suspect we're going to need to actually provide those as supporting evidence when you approach the TGA. One of the catches here that we've got to consider is any time we're going to start to rebuild, recreate, modify an existing product, it will make someone in that process the legal manufacturer of that product. That is where the involvement with the TGA comes in. As I said earlier, there's an expedited pathway for that, and the TGA will definitely look at how they can push that through quicker. To your point, you know, if it's an Australian-based manufacturer, they can absolutely be the sponsor as well. Like everything, again, I'll leave the liability question, but you know, the sponsor is ultimately responsible for the product on the market in Australia. I think I answered it, Tim.
Liz, would you like to address the liability question?
Sure, do my best. If you are the manufacturer, you're going to have liability if something goes wrong. If you're the designer, you're going to have liability if something goes wrong. I think part of it goes back to my earlier comment about having clarity around who's responsible for what. So there's a number of different components in this product. So who's responsible for each, you know, design element, for the process, for the testing, for the communication with the end user to make sure that you're actually delivering what's required, you know, in the context of a COVID-19 patient as opposed to some other sort of patient. So we can get caught up with the whole liability question, but when you sort of calm down, it gets back to those common sense of understanding where your responsibility is, what you're responsible for, and how you've engaged with the other parts of the supply chain process to be clear about, you know, each person's responsibility, so that hopefully they all come together and you have a product that works.
Thanks, Liz. Jane from New South Wales Smart Sensing Network, I see you've kind of been putting through a few things around this area. Did you want to comment on that or further afield on the discussion so far?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on a bad network. I'm actually in my car, long story, but so I won't go live with myself. I've just invited Jamie. Sorry, Tim, I was trying to get hold of you to let you know. Jamie is the ex-managing director of Medtronic for the last 17 years here in Australia. And I just talked to him about the design files being backdated and not being able to get components. And he would like to add to that, if that's okay, Tim. He's online now.
Are they online? Yeah. Start talking, please.
Jamie, can we just unmute you? It's the just on the left-hand side of your screen, a red. If you just press that.
So I can see Jamie is there.
Unmute him.
Oh,
There.
okay.
Perfect.
You can hear me?
Very good, yes.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I'm not
Thank
too sure
you.
who's on the call. Jane just called me a second ago. And I'm not I've got to say, I'm not an expert on ventilators, but I know that there's been a lot of discussion about the Medtronic intensive care ventilators. They've got a couple of models. You know, the one that their latest intensive care ventilator is the PB980, which is the one that is used in intensive care units. But I think you guys are asking about the other ventilator that they've offered plans. I think Omar Ishrak, who's the CEO, has offered plans to the marketplace for people to manufacture that intensive care ventilator, but not the 980, the older model. Is that what your question's about?
Yeah, well, it wasn't really more of a question. It was more of a comment that when we looked at the designs, most of the components date back from 2006 or so, and many of those components are no longer available. And if only one of them was not available, then we can't build the product at all.
Yeah.
If we have to replace it, then we have to go through a redesign process.
Yeah, I mean, look, you would hope that you know, Medtronic issuing that. I mean, it came from the chairman. Well, Omar was the CEO, now he's the chairman of the board. But it's interesting that they would issue that without making sure that people could get access to the parts. The guy who heads up the business up in the US is my old boss, actually, Bob White. He's the vice president for the minimally invasive therapy group. And he was responsible for putting the team together for the latest model. So look, I guess, so you are looking at manufacturing this potentially in Australia, or not in Australia, or somewhere else?
Yeah, look, it's a hypothetical. So
Yeah.
I realise you've just come in on the conversation, so you're probably not across it. But look, thank you very much. Maybe you could just listen in for the next few minutes. And I'd like actually now to go to Mark Flynn, if that's all right, Nathan, because Mark's been pumping in a furious number of questions and comments here. And rather than trying to read them out, Mark came online and just picked out what you think is the most important point you've made there, Mark.
I think, thank you, Tim. I think there's a couple of comments that are important. And
Mark, would you like to explain where you're from and have been? Because I know you're from, you've left Newcastle University, didn't you?
So I used to be at Newcastle University, and then before that, I spent 10 years senior management at Cochlear, and before that at a couple of startups in neurostimulation and also in stroke. So I'm very aware of the challenges that we're trying to pursue here. I think there's a few things that we need to probably consider, and I'll throw them out as points to consider. One of them is that in the discussions I've been having with hospitals and procurement of everything from sanitizers to masks to everything that's going on at the moment, one of the key aspects is that the hospitals will only deal with a validated supplier who is already an existing supplier to the hospital system. So that we have to be very cognizant of that as to who is actually going to be the manufacturer, and will the hospitals recognize them as a manufacturer, or do we have to go through a whole supplier audit of that supplier? So that's sort of the first point. The second one was that Mick Farrell in the Financial Times, probably 2 days ago, I can send the link if people are interested, was speaking about the challenges of ResMed and ventilators. And he was very clear that singular challenge that they have is actually missing parts in the supply chain. And he was making a plea or a side comment that actually what they saw, and remember it's with their side, saw was not that they see the solution as lots of people building different types of ventilators, but more as to engaging with ResMed as to what are the key components that are missing in their supply chain that is stopping them from ramping up production. Because they felt that if those supply chain holes that they had were filled by Australian suppliers, then they could ramp up production faster than we could by having new suppliers come on board. So I think that's an interesting question as to, as we're in a hypothetical, should we actually be making a ventilator, or should we be engaging with ResMed and others who have that capability to help them ramp up faster? So that was sort of the two main comments. There were some other ones about usability and design, but I think we can get to that in a little bit. Tim.
I'll hand it back to Nathan now. Have you got any other questions from the chat stream, Nathan? You want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to put it to everyone first, because there's been quite a few coming through. So did anyone want to comment on and there's some really deep layers of discussion there, both from Jamie and Mark. So thank you for adding that and contributing. Did anyone either want to add to that or to ask a question for any of our contributors that we've had so far?
I mean, in terms of getting approval in Australia, the device has to be approved by the TGA. I mean, I'm sure the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, would do the right thing in terms of putting through fast approvals for any new devices. But I can assure you that, you know, the ropes we had to go through to get the 980 approved were significant. The current ventilator, which is one of the top ventilators in the world for intensive care units. The other thing is, maybe this was discussed before, I thought I saw Dyson had actually developed a ventilator as well, and within 10 days they've got it in production. Maybe you guys have discussed this before, but you're aware of that. Dyson is in there.
Yeah, we at the start of the presentation we did talk through a few of those things. One of the issues is that these countries are so terrified that even if they are producing in the UK, the government's not allowing them to be exported. So, and the same is happening in the US. They're not allowing any ventilators to leave the country. So, for example, a little bit earlier on,
Trump just made a statement on TV, apparently, that he was happy to. They've got excess ventilators in the US now. I don't know whether that's true, and you never know what. There's some interesting statements that he made. But someone mentioned that they just heard that they had excess ventilators in the US. I mean, the ventilators that come from Medtronic are all manufactured in the US, I believe, although some of them also come from Ireland, from Galway.
So what we've been talking about is, hypothetically, if we were to do one here, how would we do it? One of the questions that came up, so Serena Ross from CircuitWise Electronics Manufacturing earlier offered to manufacture the devices in her factory, because she is an ISO 13485 certified. But as Mark pointed out, she's not on the approved supplier list to hospitals, and I assume somebody like Medtronic would be. So hypothetically, if we were to build a device, let's say in the next 10 days, we were able to actually start pumping out these units, hypothetically, and we were to try and get it to the hospitals. Can you think of a path where we could do this locally and have something manufactured locally, maybe under the sponsorship of somebody like Medtronic?
Yeah, I mean, Medtronic is certainly not geared up for local manufacture in Australia whatsoever. I mean, ResMed, I've been to the ResMed facility. In fact, they used to be in an old building, but ResMed would be more geared up to manufacture something like that. But Medtronic, their manufacturing is all overseas. So, they could help in terms of approval processes and facilitating the information, but there's no way they've got any access to manufacturing in Australia. I mean, very few companies do.
Yeah, I'd like to open up to everyone now, because this is a really key question that Mark raised. And setting aside, this is a hypothetical, so you know, let's say we had 6 months or a year to do this, or actually a couple of years. If we were to develop a new product like this and take it to market, and you had a great idea, but you didn't want to be a ISO, you didn't want to be a product sponsor yourself, but we wanted to manufacture in Australia. Or we did want to do this in real time within 6 or 8 weeks. Any thoughts out there about how practically we could actually do this in Australia right now?
Guys, Mark raised a good point that ResMed is authorized, is a regular supplier approved for hospitals. They know what to do. It's just that they are missing some components in between. How difficult is it for them to quickly go out to tender and source suppliers from within Australia? To me, that makes common sense, but is there something that we are missing in that process?
I can talk on that. Depending on what the components are, the lead time might be excessive. There might be 12, 14 weeks lead time. So ramping up that quickly, trying to get all the components, all the plastics, the housing is going to take time. So they might have had someone back order, but just to ramp up the plastics alone, it's excessive. Normally a unit like that, I would say probably was in the 20-week lead time, and to get it that fast out to market. So the reason why, look, I could say to Medtronic, please provide me with your current design and I'll manufacture it, but I'm going to have the same problem with their design. They've got beautiful plastics and hardware and everything that goes on the outside that's all custom made, that I have to call up their factory with the tool and get in the queue. Whereas if we design something from scratch, we can think about all the things that take time to manufacture, to procure, and make sure we have none of that. We have no custom boxes, we have no pretty labels, we just have it in some off-the-shelf box, some tubing that you can get at Bunnings if you had to, you know, everything that's already here in the country, and we make the most basic version that has nothing custom in there, and that's how you can get out to the market quickly. I think ResMed's falling over because they're still, and not saying they're falling over, but they're struggling to keep up with demand because they're still trying to stick with their ResMed unit, their look and feel ResMed unit, not the internals. I think it's the external that's probably the issue for them.
Isn't the most efficient thing to do here just to take the ResMed unit and identify the parts that need to be redesigned and only design those parts?
I think so.
I think the main thing Serena's sort of main point that she's making there is being strategic and using a bit of common sense around the best approach in the shortest amount of time, and designing a product that's suited to processes that are quick to implement is the way to go, and the components that are readily available, and piggybacking off the work that Jeff's done at Genesis. You know, they're trying to repeat what's already been proven in the past. These are all strategic elements that lead you to the fastest development.
Are we sure that ResMed is not actually trying to do that? I mean, it would seem business 101 that if you have a supply chain issue and if you have a demand, that you should be trying to solve that. And if ResMed do have production of 5,000 a week, I would challenge anyone on this call to say whether they could design, implement, build a supply chain and do 5,000 a week within 14 weeks.
Or source it from Asia, where plastics come out quite quickly and cheaply. There are no restrictions so far in Asia about not exporting what's required to manufacture a mask, like the US has come down with. Is that an option for ResMed?
Thanks, Yannicki. I'll go to Lincoln, who had a question or comment before.
Yeah, Jeff kind of touched on it, and Serena sort of really drove it home. I think that what really hasn't been considered is the feature set the ventilator may have, and you know, adding features has an overhead, especially design, but also largely regulatory, but then also for the supply chain. And I think that going back to the very beginning and reconsidering and challenging what's actually needed for a minimum viable product. And because the resource here is, well, the limited resource is time, and regulatory overhead takes time, and a supply chain takes time. So actually, one of the responsibilities of design is to be diligent with what we specify in the product. So I think that the very important very early on is to only pick out the features that are necessary from a safety and efficacy point of view, and everything else, which I think is what Jeff mentioned before, all the extra features that would be nice to have can come out in version 2 or version 3. But to really sort of address the current need, and in this case, this hypothetical case, although the COVID-19 is very real, it would need to be the absolute minimum device.
I mean, that's a good point. I don't know whether I can comment here, but there's ventilators and there's respirators. I mean, it's a lung disease that attacks the lungs, and I guess we need to clarify from the intensivists who run the intensive care units. A respirator that may help someone in the home is very different to a ventilator that is used in an intensive care unit. An intensive care unit, the devices that Medtronic sell need intubation. So that means they have to stick a tube down your throat so you don't choke, and to help the lungs work. So it'd be interesting to know what sort of, that sounds like a respirator.
Maybe.
Rather than a ventilator. And look, again, I'm not an expert on all this technology myself, but you'd really need to, because the intensive care units are the ones who are wanting access to this technology. And I'm not sure that a unit, the ResMed unit is the one that the intensive care units want.
Can I comment? It's John Knight here. I'm a physician. There are currently 2,500 intensive care beds in Australia, and the government's working very hard to triple that number to 7,500. But that's a very ambitious target. Right. So I think those very high volume figures are looking at supplying Asia and Africa. I read there's only 14 ventilators for the whole of Papua New Guinea, which has a population of 8 million people, for example. So those are the numbers. Those are the ICU numbers for Australia. That's the size of the market for Australia.
Tim, can you go back to your screen? You had on the ResMed site?
Yeah, can you see now?
Yeah, I can see it, but
yeah, I think that is the one that's being built in Melbourne.
So you can see on that screen there that it can be adapted. I think it's primarily for things like in this screen here. If you want to go for a walk and you need to be ventilated, and this is obviously intubated through the throat here. It's primarily a battery. If you engineer for mobility, if you see there, weighs 3.2 kilograms, runs on batteries. So I think what they're, I'm guessing here. I really have no idea. I just want to clarify that. I'm not privy to any information from ResMed, but I'm assuming that what they're doing is they're trying to convert this to ramp up something that can run off 240 volts and support somebody for a couple of weeks in a hospital environment.
Thanks, Tim. I'll put a question to everyone around this issue broadly that we're facing immediately. So this is a health issue that's facing Australia broadly and the globe. And if we think about, say, our own families, our neighbours, and this issue is something that is immediate, so say it's a hypothetical. And if we had an immediate need to deliver X amount of ventilators at rapid speed, at best quality, what would be Australia's best path forward to deliver on that in a very quick, efficient, and high quality fashion? And feel free, anyone, to jump in on that.
Yes, Jeff here. I would say if there is an existing design that is suitable or a design that can be repurposed by a company like ResMed, everyone putting their support behind that would be by far preferable than trying to invent something from scratch or resurrect an old design.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other comments?
This is probably the unpopular opinion, but I actually disagree that we shouldn't be designing it from scratch, and that's perhaps not entirely because I'm a designer. I think that because we want to design it and manufacture it in Australia with the limited resources that we have, it should be designed specifically for what's available. You know, there are manufacturers in Australia like Circuitwise, and there are, you know, plastics and sheet metal and all of that. There's not many of them, but there are. And, you know, partnering with those suppliers in the design would actually allow us to design it and manufacture it in Australia. You know, repurposing an old design, you know, does have its problems, or like the an open source design does have its problems in that we may not be able to, you know, completely meet the need inside Australia. Yes.
Yeah.
Copying it can be a bit constraining in that you're dealing with something that's designed to be a lot more than what's immediately required. So I think Lincoln's on the right track, but there's also
Thanks, Campbell.
multiple passes.
Thank you. I think we've got a few minutes remaining, and I think where we've ended up now is getting to another point, which I'd like to touch on just at the end, which is around, this isn't just about actually medtech, it's about Australian manufacturing broadly. So the coronavirus or current health disruption that we're facing, as well as economic, has really forced us to rethink our supply chains and our reliance on other countries. I wanted to maybe potentially get your opinion from a medtech perspective around, can we have an opportunity to rethink Australia's role in terms of medtech manufacturing? And welcome anyone to jump in there.
That's a big fat yes, isn't it?
And I think it's not just medtech. I think this whole situation is going to make us rethink about manufacturing in Australia at a much wider level. You know, if we, just getting back to the ventilator thing, we had hundreds and hundreds of ventilators and they were flying out the factory door. We still wouldn't have enough people to support them and get them to where they're needed, and to manage patients and to provide all the technical support. And the supply chain, I think, would struggle to keep up with it no matter what we do. And you've got to remember, we're trying to solve a problem that's going to start hurting us in a couple of weeks. If you look at the trajectory for infections, we're trying to get ventilators out to patients to help support them, you know, a month from now. It's going to be impossibly difficult.
Nathan, I would make the comment that this has been a hypothetical exercise about ventilators, but if you take the question more broadly, you know, should we be trying to, you know, build more ResMeds and more Cochlears in Australia? Well, obviously everyone's trying to do that. And I think, you know, the key thing, we all know what needs to be done, and that is we need to build on the fantastic expertise in our universities to come through with some cutting edge technologies that really give us a point of differentiation and try and grow them, you know, at home. I think possibly is the main vehicle to do that. Genesis has just been involved in a CRCP application for a very exciting medical technology. We hope to be able to tell you about in June when they announce the results of the next round. But that is really, I think, the way forward, you know, to rebuild to build the industry further.
Look, it's always been an aspiration of companies to manufacture in Australia. Even if you look at Cochlear, they're now unfortunately moving more of their manufacturing offshore, which I'm sure you're aware of. You know, when you look at manufacturing medical devices, the domestic market is one that's really important. Hence, that's why a lot of companies will manufacture in the US or in Europe, because they've got a domestic market. Our domestic market in Australia is about 2% of the worldwide medical device market. So it's quite tiny. So you can't just think about manufacturing products for the Australian market. I know you're not, but the world market, once you start talking about the world market, then you're competing with all the other companies who are distributing those technologies, who have representation in every country of the world. So again, I'm not trying to be negative about it. You know, Medtronic have looked at varying sites around the world, and they've gone to place, you know, their latest pacemaker manufacturing facilities in Singapore. The Singapore government bent over backwards to provide financial support and encouragement for Medtronic to manufacture there. Ireland, the Ireland story, most medical device companies are in Ireland because of the tax level that was set up 15, 20 years ago for 15%. Switzerland is another place in the world where companies manufacture due to the tax benefits. I just, there'd have to be a lot of change in the Australian market again, because the domestic market opportunity is so small. As I said, less than 2%. There's not a huge incentive for companies to look at setting up local manufacturing. Could we do it in Australia? Yes. Does it make sense to be a manufacturing supply in the world from Australia? It's a challenge. I mean, just ask ResMed Cochlear. So I'm sounding negative, but we've talked about this for years. I've always wanted to, through the MTAA, the Medical Technology Association, I've always wanted to encourage local manufacturing in Australia, medical devices, and I think they should be included in this discussion.
Jamie, though, the fact that government is wanting us to manufacture here, don't you think this is possibly the perfect storm for them to change the conditions to replicate Singapore here?
Exactly. I'd like to support that. Having worked for Australia in the early years of Cochlear and ResMed, personally went out to give them government grants for export. So what both companies did was early in the piece, catered to the global market and pitched their product. So they didn't start manufacturing only for Australia. They realized there was a need in Asia, closest market, easy to access, and then they went into massive production. So for 8 years, they had government grants of $250,000 in the old days. This is going back 20 years, 22 years, and they just flew with their product. So I think we should look at the market as not just Australia. We know there's a demand overseas, or depending on what the product is. I'm talking about masks, but look, if whatever the product you establish, the global demand, verify the markets, do your discovery, and then go into production, there will be assistance. And also